Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in this panel to talk about a very current topic, especially in this day and age of COVID pandemic. We're going to be talking about science elitism. And we have today Layla Martin, whom we had as a speaker yesterday. She's a space theorist and astrofeminist who is interested in all sorts of topics. You can see more about her conversations and her different interests by following her on Twitter. Her handle is @FreeBarbarella, so feel free to check her out. Our next speaker is Lamar Glover from California State University in Dominguez Hills. Lamar is a physicist, activist, and music recording artist who was featured on the documentary Behind the Curve in 2018. He earned his MS in physics at Cal State Los Angeles with a research background in optics and material science related to LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. He is the co-author of 2 publications in scientific journals, and his professional tech experiences range from microfluidics engineering to QA engineering and website test automation. So I pass the floor now to Layla and Lamar.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Quite an introduction. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm impressed.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah, we did the panel yesterday. We're here again today. And I'm just going to lean up here really quick to see. Okay, we have the participants. We can see we have some people here. Thank you
folks.
for joining us. And we really appreciate you taking time to, listen to what we have to say.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about science and elitism and how that affects, our lives and how important it is. And I think it's going to be a good talk. We have a lot of things to say.
Right.
First, I think it's interesting just how we met. Because I saw you in the documentary.
Right. I just want to also clarify that although I was in this documentary, I need to state clearly that I am not a flat earther. That's often a question I get. And so the earth is totally round, totally. We've known about it for millennia, right? There's all kinds of records. It's one of those things of multiple discovery, everyone knows the world is round, so. Yeah.
You're not a flat earther.
Not at all. Respect and love to that community. Some very nice people reached out to me. I'm supposed to have dinner with someone eventually pretty soon. We actually had plans right before the beginning of the pandemic, but.
I am so impressed by you and the way that you, in the documentary, why I reached out to you is you talked about that these people are not uneducated, they're miseducated. And I just really appreciated the empathy and the understanding. And I think you took some of them out and you went and did some science experiments or the engagement, like you're willing to really try to understand. And that was my reason for watching the documentary. I remember it was right in the beginning of COVID and I had some time and I thought, I want to understand this community more. It wasn't watching it like most people, to make fun of like this and kind of write it off. I really appreciated that about you. And then I found your information and reached out and, thankfully you responded. And it's such a neat part of the world that you can do that nowadays.
Yes.
I'm always amazed. Like I saw that guy on TV. He's really cool. And we talk and are friends.
Yes.
Are we friends?
Yes.
And we thought, Lamar and I thought that we would do this in LA because we're both here.
Right.
And instead of doing a panel with a bunch of different people, we wanted to make it more engaging and kind of like a conversation. And before we get started, I wanted to bring up that we're vaccinated and have had a bunch of COVID tests and we're trying to social distance and we weren't going to wear masks during the thing. Anyways, we're aware of COVID and trying to be COVID compliant. We also, I think it's just really nice that we can have this talk together.
Yes, definitely.
After we met our first call on Zoom. And so it's just funny.
Right.
that
that eventually, like a year later, it's like we're still Zooming, but yeah.
Right. And I first met you and I'm like, you're really tall. Like you have an idea of someone.
Right. Yes.
So
yes.
That was funny. Anyhow, so what do you feel about science and elitism, just generally this topic?
I think that science is a body of knowledge, right? And like anything of value, it's guarded, right? And access to it is limited, and and some things they don't pretend as if they're not that. Like if you want to get into, let's say, finance, right? Finance doesn't necessarily lead with the idea that it's for everybody, right? There's some aspects of it, like maybe the Robin Hood app or whatever, but generally speaking, there's an air of like, if I'm in the world of finance, this is an elite field, right? Science gives off the idea that it's a kind of like easy access, sort of like if it's just the facts, right? But that's not completely the true reality of the situation. The knowledge itself, in order to accrue it, that access is guarded, is often taught in a dogmatic way, even though it's made to seem as if it's like pure knowledge. And like there's been efforts made to put more emphasis on the scientific method, but in the day, a lot of us remember Newton's second law of motion, F equals ma, because someone beat it in our head with a stick, right? And like everything else we know with science, we might remember the quadratic formula or geometric proofs or Roy G. Biv. Like those are things that we're just told, right? And we remember them, right? And they're just accepted as truths. They're not really challenged, right? So there's this whole idea that if you have something that's guarded access and is taught with elements of dogma, right, then you're going to have something that's going to have an elite nature to it. Who has access to define what is what and what is not, right? I think a lot of our challenges are right now is that this has limits when it comes to education or participation, right?
Exactly. That was one of the things I was going to say, is that the participation is limited. Not everybody can participate in research. Particularly, I'm thinking of if just to access research and academic papers.
Right.
When I hit them outside of the Harvard Library, it says you have to pay, and I think that's kind of an important point. Is like. Right. You can't necessarily read everything. It's not all open and free and easy to access. And also it's really boring.
That can't be overstated.
I am a scholar and, have been in school my entire life and an academic. And I can't tell you how, reading these papers as somebody who has done it for a really long time, it's difficult. Right. To get through them, and they're not really always very clear. And so if I wasn't in that world and I tried to look at some of these research papers, I wouldn't understand it and I wouldn't want to, right. And so it's almost like you're using, English in the academic paper, but not any words or things that, right. People can understand. And so it's not accessible.
Right.
That's a problem.
You're mentioning about the papers reminds me of a recent tweet from a friend of mine who's a professor in Alabama, and he's a physics professor, and his department is trying to save money on basically academic journal subscriptions. So they're basically going to not subscribe to 12 different journals, and it's going to save the department like somewhere a little bit below $30,000 a year. Mind you, that the head coach of Alabama's football team this year is making millions of dollars, right?
Exactly.
So like, there's like,
what do we prioritize?
Right. So there's a prioritization there, but even when you're in academia itself, there's even limits to the access, right? So someone who maybe, let's say they're working at a Ivy or maybe like a Caltech or MIT, they might not have the same issues as someone who's working in terms of access to certain things as is someone
the library
or State U or things of that nature, right? There's limits within the community itself. And if there's limits within the community itself, those who are outside of the community, there's no really hope for access to the knowledge.
Exactly. It's the access to the knowledge and the the journals themselves are very expensive. If you
Right,
did,
right.
like
Yeah.
before I went back to grad school, I was interested in Harvard, the Divinity School. I wanted to, read those papers, but you have to subscribe, and it's not like a magazine subscription.
Not
The
at all.
pricing, you know what I mean? It was
Right,
like
right.
$500 or whatever.
Right.
And so I think it's that. And then I was thinking about just the competition between academics themselves.
Yeah.
It's not like a very inclusive,
No.
group of people. And it's like, I know both of us, we've talked about it, is like, we are very bright and
Right.
we don't have our PhDs, and
Right.
we're not
gonna
going
get
to
them.
do them. And so you have
Right.
here is like really interesting, I thought. And one of the reasons like we thought about doing this talk is like,
Right.
we're smart, we can contribute.
Yeah.
The environment of academia is so negative. And for me, the harassment and the attitude and the culture is not anything that I'm interested in participating. And I won't, even if I could get my PhD for free.
Right.
I don't want to be part of it. It's really, really demeaning, I found it. And I think that's really upsetting, because you think about how many people are smart that are from a different background than the typical scientist white male, and how many people don't want to be part of the community because of the way that they are treated. So what do we have? A comment here.
Yeah.
Journals, open access, that's cool.
Right. So there's one organization that's open access journals, and there's like little hacks we can all do. Like one of the things I tell my students often is one of the best ways to develop a relationship with someone who's doing research that you like is just literally reaching out and asking them for a PDF of their latest paper. They'll be flattered and also glad to give it to you. So, I mean, obviously there's ways by hook or by crook to get access to things. It's just that is not the best or most efficient way of going about things. It's much more efficient to basically go in JSTOR and just bada bing, bada boom, as opposed to emailing people and hoping that they return back to you, email back to you. So, I mean, there are ways with which we can get that access, but it's limited,
I think that's a good point. Yes, of course you can reach out to people. Right. I didn't know who to reach out to before I went back to school, and then you don't want to intrude, and that's not very practical to expect people just to write back. But it's right. What I think is really important, that you're telling your students it's okay to reach out and to try to connect with people. And I wish, when I was younger, that they had said that, and it wasn't like that. It was more of like, these are adults, this is this community, and if you're not in it, then don't bother them.
Right.
And now it's so easy too with social and
right.
Anyhow, I wanted to bring up that I was doing some research about our topic, and that this is not a new phenomena, science and elitism. I found an academic paper talking about science and elitism, but from the American Society for Information Science in 1971. So right. I think it's interesting, like, people tend to think like right now this is happening, you know what I mean, in the counterculture movement. And it's like, you have insight. No, this is as old as
very, very old
people themselves.
Yes, basically.
Counterculture.
Yeah, and we're in a spot right now in the evolution of science, particularly in the States, where we need more people with STEM backgrounds. We're walking into an information age, and it's going to be really important that people can compute, people can design, people can will understand all the different aspects of the higher levels of science. It's really important that we become more inclusive and include more people. And one of the great things I like about teaching is that particularly with the science, math and science background, is that the equations are the same no matter where you go, no matter what campus you're on, right? Maxwell's equations are going to be the same. They're not different in Pasadena than they are in like Fort Lauderdale, right? They're the same ones. And you teach people the same thing, they learn the same techniques, and the skills are highly transferable. I think that it's not going to take very much in order for us to basically open up these doors. And a lot of it is just going to be, like you mentioned, someone in the comments about the American Astronomical Society basically having their journals transitioning to open access, right? If we get into a world where that's happening, that's a big step It might not seem like a big deal, but it's a huge step in basically giving more access and being more inclusive.
Absolutely.
If I may, I just wanted to see if we could continue a bit this conversation about open access. I work with the Policy Studies Organization, and one main area of our activity is the publishing of journals, academic journals. And so some of our journals are subscription based, meaning you do have to be subscribed, you have to pay a subscription to access them. And some of them are completely open access. And so we've been feeling there has been recently, this idea that everything should be open access, and that is obviously going to increase accessibility of knowledge for everyone. But one issue about that is that at the end of the day, the truth is that somebody has to, nothing is free. In reality, somebody has to pay for it. And so meaning that when we have an open access publication, it means that we are using funding from other sources in order to do the copy editing, to pay assistant editors, the website, the layout, the design, etc. So I'm not saying that there's an either or answer, but probably, like with most things, the answer is probably complicated. It's a matter of finding the funding to provide that open access. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. When I got into academia, it was later in life, and I come from an entertainment industry background. I used to be a creative director at Warner Brothers. And when I learned that, like, you're supposed to write all these papers and do all this research and you publish and you don't even get paid for it, right, I was like, what the heck? Right. So when you say, right, yeah, open access is cool, the idea is great that everybody can read everything all the time, but it's not free. The years of research, right, the years of trying to put all of these ideas together. And I've just been amazed in the academic community that there's this expectation that people are going to keep working, but how do they make any money? We have bills and we need to eat. Right. It's like we can't live on air. So I think it's really interesting, the idea of open, right, access, but how is there compensation? And I think, Lamar, what I would like to know your opinion, and then with the music industry, because you, right, have that background, right, how do you feel about? So
it's kind of like one of the things when I switched from, I was involved with the arts community as well as the nonprofit community before I got involved in that, the world of science, right? One of the things I've realized that's a kind of a common thread, just like, you switch hats, but it's still a hat, right? And one of the things that all the hats in these states have is that basically there's a dynamic of, we're going to try to get people to do as much as possible for as little as possible, right? That was very evident in the world of music, very evident in the nonprofit world, and also very evident in the world of science, right? While base salaries may change and differ and may be better in other places, the dynamics still exist, right? So yes, there's a situation where we're talking about, like, we need to figure out a way to pay, right, for these journals to be published and to be put together. And that's definitely, we need to figure that out. And I like what you said of the fact that it's not going to be just a simple solution, right? It's going to be, we have to sit down and think about that. But I think that's something, if we're committed to thinking about it and making that a priority, then that can be done. Because as it is right now, like, the knowledge within those papers are being funded by the underpaid or even non-paid people. When I was doing the research, when I was not getting paid the same rate as other people. I had a fellowship and student loans, right? The undergrads working with me, I would buy them pizza. I mean, like, it's that was me being a nice grad student, mm-hmm, right? So there's a lot of free or undervalued labor even just going into the product, that which gets basically, repackaged and put out there, right? Mm-hmm. I think that we need to look at the whole system in general, right? But in terms of the idea of inclusion and basically the challenge to elitism is basically trying to make this more inclusive, right? One of the ways to make this all more inclusive is to challenge the idea that only some people can access all of the knowledge, right? If I can't access the latest dialogues that are happening, right, on the subject matter, right? If I don't know who's doing what, or if I'm stepping on toes, I submit something to a paper and someone already did it, like, for example, like that's, what do we, what I mean? So, like, yeah, I think that is one thing that this pandemic has definitely shown and taught me, and I've seen worldwide, is that we've had this worldwide trauma event. Every single person on the earth has experienced this, and we had to dramatically shift our lives, right? None of us used Zoom like 2 years ago. Well, maybe not none of us, but we were like, what happened to Skype?
They still use it in the UK.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And you're like, Skype.
What's that? Who's that? Right. But we've all learned new things. We've all done new things. Trillions of dollars were reallocated because it was a priority to do this because we had to, right? And the motivation for that was basically a worldwide pathological pandemic, right? I would love to see humanity, maybe not the whole entire world, but at least our corner of the world, move forward in a way towards a vision, as opposed to away from disaster, being proactive, reaching towards our goals, as opposed to waiting for us to try to fix a problem. This country's had a problem of inclusion for centuries, since its founding, right? One of the things we were talking about.
Talk about the.
Oh, Onesimus?
Yes.
Right. So it's kind of a nice little segue.
It's amazing.
So just to talk about the intersectionality of like how things have kind of been messed up for a long time. There was a guy, I'm blanking on his name right now, but he was involved with the Salem witch trials. We all kind of know about that from pop culture, and Halloween's around the corner, right? While we popularized it, it was a very traumatic event for a lot of women that were involved in that, right?
Yeah, I did a lot of research on. I wrote tons of papers on Salem. It's really actually like so interesting,
right.
With pop culture, but the reality is very different. And so that's why this is an interesting tie-in.
Right. So one of the men who was involved with that, he was a preacher. He also was a slave owner. He was given the gift of a slave by his congregation, right? We also always think of the North. There were no slaves in the North. This is like, Massachusetts. There definitely were. And this man went by the name of Onesimus. It wasn't his birth name. And he was given that name from the Bible, New Testament, and it was the name of a slave there. So he, the reason I'm bringing him up is that he's the first documented instance of basically inoculation in America, right? The credit often went to another person who knew about Onesimus's technique, and what he would do is that he learned this technique, and they believe because there's some language around where he's from. They believe he's from Ghana, but it's not certain, right? But he would take basically a pustule, like from an infected person, basically get that, and he would basically inject that material into other people to basically inoculate them with that. Another person by the name of, I want to say Boylston, I could be mispronouncing it, got it slightly wrong. But all this stuff is very accessible, right? He took credit for it, right? And there was a statue for him up in the Boston area for a while. And only until recently, 2015, 2016, was there a dialogue about Onesimus, right? So
the first vaccination.
The first, in essence, in America was done by a West African man, right? Who was enslaved, right? So
and then we go into science and mistrust.
Right. So you have like literally, you take people's accomplishments. That happens in science. Someone does something, you take credit for it. If there was a dime for every woman who did a calculation and a man took credit for it, we'd be like Scrooge McDuck, just swimming through these dimes, right? It's so many of them happen for centuries. You can go all the way back to Lady Lovelace to like people who are still alive, like Katherine Johnson.
Hattie Lamar,
Right.
I mean, my goodness,
right.
I'm sure.
We could hit every decade between the 16th century and now that's documented, and we could hit somebody, right?
What about those stories we don't know,
right?
That's what it's like. We know these are the few that have trickled in, but like, there's the tip of the iceberg,
right? So we have this history that we can't ignore of like marginalization, taking credit for work, to the point that there's huge populations amongst people of color who don't trust vaccines because the fact that they are the people who created vaccines has been taken from them, right?
Not to mention all of the experiments and, you know,
right.
why would they trust?
No, there's no reason to.
So a very interesting point here is that, and I'm just thinking about it, sometimes we tend to think of science as if it exists, as if science was something that existed out there in the abstract. But really, more than science, it's human knowledge made by human beings who are scientists. And because we are human beings, we are full of biases and historical errors and all these terrible things that we've done before. So, you know, I think there's an issue here about, do you think that perhaps the scientific community could use a bit more sense of perhaps humility in terms of not taking science as a uniformly accepted thing, but prone to error and bias and racism, misogyny?
I would say that, and you can definitely correct me or add or whatever. Like, I would just say that any body of knowledge is cannot be inherently objective if it's put together by humans. There's no way that humans who are formed by human culture and other human interactions are going to come together and to make an objective body of knowledge. Some of our greatest innovations in science has been become from a different perspective. When someone took a step back and said, hey, those epicycles, they work, but what if the sun's the center, right? As opposed to basically the earth being the center, which has been dictated by culture, right? Culture tells us that the earth is the center, right? From our perspective, right? We take a step back and say, hey, let's actually have the sun be the center. All of a sudden, all kinds of things open up, right? And so there's all kinds of things that as we get older and grayer, we're going to have all kinds of scientific discoveries and innovations that are going to be based on knowledge that we have on the table right now, right this second. And someone takes a step back and takes a look outside of the box and says, this is a different changed perspective, but our perspective is determined by our culture, right? And science is a culture in and of itself, right? The fact that if you go to someone and say, hey, I studied this sort of field, and they will ask you about a certain textbook you read. Oh, like, you know, if I'm a physics grad student, I'm taking EM, right? And someone says, oh, you read Jackson? That was crazy, right? And that's a typical thing. So we have a shared cultural experience. Jackson is an awful textbook, right? But it's a shared trauma, right? So, but that's among physicists. And I'm sure that happens amongst all other fields as well, too. You can't, if there's a shared thing, and we know that there's literally like anthropology, which is where I got my degree, my undergrad degree was in anthropology. That field of study was created, formed specifically to uphold white supremacy, right? That was the whole point of it, right? It was like, and it is basically been working ever since then to take those elements out of it, and some ways successful, in some ways they're still working on it, right? And so, but there's no way you can say that that's not true for every other field of knowledge. Like, that's just is what it is.
I think the idea of just trying to bring up a different perspective or ask about a counter perspective, it's met with such pushback. I think that just in my own experience as the theorist who coined the term astrofeminism and developed the theory, it's like, now I'm done, so what? Well, I have to put the information out there. What's the idea? I was talking to Lamar about this right before we went on, is the reception of just asking questions and asking if there's a counter perspective in the way that we interact with space has been met with just not nice people saying very nasty things. And I think that it's really important to understand that this hesitancy to engage in the communication, it's like, people say, don't worry about the comments, but it upsets me because some of them have been very nasty. And I think people also don't realize that, I have 4 children. My 16-year-old son called me yesterday because I had an article come out in the Space Review, and he was like, wow, Mom, these comments are really bad. And, tearing apart my work, my research, what I'm proposing, saying they have to print some of these occasionally just so they seem woke. just completely insulting me. And, also like, I'm not just saying this as an idea. I went to school, I went to a pretty good school and spent a lot of time researching and talking to different people and reading the literature. And so I think that it's like, not just when we have these conversations about, the scientific community and elitism, but when we engage with other people, what is the culture like and how do we change that? It's nice that we're having this talk, but it's almost like we're preaching to the choir. You know what I mean? It's like having the same conversation. I think one of the points I wanted to make is like, look at something like climate, how it's turned into a political issue and the denial of climate. And then if you like think about that, it's like the corporations and how is an economic benefit and like how did this happen where there are still people, Yale released a research study that reveals only 15% of Americans are aware that the expert climate consensus exceeds 90%. So I think that's really important to like think about. It's not that the experts aren't on the same page, but people aren't aware. And we were told a lot of different conflicting things, just like in COVID, you know what I mean? And so I think it's like, how do we connect and unite the United States? It feels to me almost like a civil war. Like, and I think it's really important that like we understand the other side. That's why I'm publishing these articles in space-based reviews. It's not a feminist, journal where everyone's going to say, oh, good job, go girl. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm going into, territory that they're not going to be very receptive because I want to move the dialogue forward. And I can't do that if everyone agrees with me. But I also have to like put on my big girl pants and like be okay with being insulted and ripped apart. And I think it's like, that's scary too, as a woman. Like, am I going to be safe? Are they going to attack my family and my kids? And it's like, I'm not saying anything that bad. I'm just asking if there's a different way of looking at this. And it's not met with, wow, let's, I think only one person out of like 50 said, wow, she's just asking if we can think about this differently. That's all that's happening here. And trying to make you laugh. That's my thing, is like, you can present things, big ideas, if they're funny, it's a little bit easier to digest and like not writing everything like it's an academic paper. But I just feel like it's nice to have these conversations, but the reality out there in the world is like, people are really nasty, and the civility is gone. And Lamar and I were talking about this too, that like, it's so cool that we met each other and we can talk and we can have these conversations, and you're in DC. But with that, there's another side of people online without any, accountability. Why aren't there more laws against that, or tracking? You know what I mean? Like, how do you engage in a community when and speak and share your research when?
So, I mean, in some ways, one could say that scientists are responsible to a certain degree for the ways in which the culture and society perceives them. But another aspect about it is politicians too, because the politicization of science, also the politicians have a lot to do with it, especially nowadays. So, I mean, what do you think about that? To what extent are science responsible?
Yeah, I think that's a point. I was thinking of, when I was looking into this talk, I thought a lot about what happened in Kansas in '99, when there was an organization like Citizens for Objective Public Education, and they wanted to strip all evolution and any references to it from the curriculum, and they were successful. And it took basically another nonprofit basically coming in, and I forget the name of that nonprofit, but it was an organization, it's a policy group, and they had to hit the ground running, and then within less than a year, they had it overturned. The reason it worked was because they did the work. They went to Kansas and they worked for months moving the needle, and they actually got there before the needle had been moved. They heard it was happening, and they got there a little bit too late to stop it, but they didn't leave, and they did the work, and they had the work overturned, right? And they stayed around and kept an eye on Kansas so that when people tried to come back and push the needle back towards science denialism, right? They were like, no, you can't do that. And that takes effort, that takes presence, right? The reason that we all buy McDonald's is because we see it every single day. I have a McCafe over the side off the camera right now because I know I can go there. I know what the coffee tastes like. I know where they are. It's not very hard. They have giant red and yellow signs everywhere. If science basically worked the same way as a community, I'm not saying we have to actually have giant signs on the side of freeways, but maybe we should. Why is that? Like, maybe that's not outside the question. And also, people understood that the scientific method requires for things. When Dr. Fauci, for example, gets on television and says something different the next month, we know that he's not confused. He has new data, right? And like, so and that's okay. But if we don't understand that, if we're so used to receiving science as a dogma coming from a tower, right? And F equals MA hasn't changed in centuries, but all of a sudden this scientist guy, just Tony from Brooklyn, keeps coming on TV and he keeps changing his story. We don't accept him because he's not one of the heroes, right? He's not in the canon, right? He's not Newton. He's not Einstein. They don't make T-shirts of him just yet, right? So we don't understand this. We don't have a common knowledge of the scientific process that's accepted all across, the country. People will accept the fact that laws change, right? People will accept the fact that prices change. There's all kinds of things we know that are dynamic within our lives that we'll accept, but we don't accept the fact that science may change and evolve, and that is a living document or a living body of knowledge right in front of us. And that's one thing I think the scientific community can work on directly, and that requires outreach. That requires things that are meaningful. And I think some places, like for example, LIGO up in Hanford, their site they would have community days where they let folks in the community come by and go be around the site. I think that's one step of many hundreds, thousands of steps in the right direction. But I think that needs to happen. I think people need to know that, if more people actually knew a scientist, right? The scientists know people, but how many people know scientists, right? How many times have you go to a room full of scientists? Like, when's the last time you went to a Little League game, right? Or when's the last time you went to a hip hop concert? Or when's the last time you went to a nail salon, right? Just like places where regular people just go, right? And if you're not in these pockets of society, you don't exist in those pockets of society, you don't have any meaningful interactions in those pockets of society, you start to realize that, oh, my bubble is very insular, right? No one has access to me, right? And even among my community, right? Someone from, let's say, Montana State might not have the exact same access as someone from Michigan State or, UMass or MIT, right? Their access to knowledge is different from one another. Like, there's work to be done. And one of the ways to basically become is more inclusive. I could definitely hit the demographic targets about how queer people, trans people, people of color, women are excluded. But it's the mechanism that does that is basically focused on not explicitly targeting those people necessarily as much as it is about including certain people and not opening any doors elsewhere, period, right? It's a door, you're never going to go to like Caltech's campus and say people who aren't cis white males are not welcome. You'll never see that, right? And you'll never talk to anyone that staff who will say anything like that, because that's not how they operate, right? However, if you can look at the enrollments, you can look at the participation, look at authors of papers, you can see that there's these biases there, and they're institutionalized. And one of the ways we need to work that is to change the institutions, right, dramatically, right? I
was going to mention the institutions because it seems a bit contradictory. On the one hand, asking the public to accept that science is constantly evolving and changing, and what you said last week may change the next day or next week because you got new data. On the other hand, the people producing this knowledge, producing this science, seem to operate in very solid silos sometimes, in the sense that, for example, people working on STEM fields are not usually talking to social scientists, philosophers, artists. If anything, the humanities tend to be, sort of like, well, the humanities, who cares, and that's part of the culture, unfortunately. So it seems a bit contradictory, then again, that we want from the public a certain openness, but being an academic in a prestigious institution or whatever, we tend to close ourselves to that same openness that we demand from the public.
Absolutely. And I think that it can't be, emphasized enough that just in the last 20 years, what I've seen of the opposing 24-hour news stations and the information that they're putting out there, that people are, looking at that and they're polarized and they're on like one side and they're not seeing the other side. And it's like, why isn't there any accountability in terms of the effect of that? If you're looking at, climate deniers, anti-vaxxers, flat earth believers, that it's like, it just feels like everything is getting, it's compounding, and there's more and more of these groups that are going in these counterculture beliefs. And it's also hard to tell who's credible and who's not, because the production value is very high. It's sophisticated. When you look at, anyone can make a YouTube channel and buy a lighting kit and edit a video that looks the same as like a documentary film. And you can purchase a, doctorate online from a non-accredited university. And so it's like, how can you tell if somebody is legit?
Right.
If you're looking through all of this different kind of stuff. And so I think like everybody has a voice and everyone has their own channel, which is good because, it gives people a forum, but it's also really incredibly dangerous. So I think in terms of these counterculture beliefs, like I was reading up on, what do they say? And they say the science denial, the disinformation, and they say we need more evidence. Well, how do you address that with the point you brought up of like, the information is changing and evolving. And so it's like, how do we change the scientific, knowledge of how the process works? How do we disseminate that information? Because that basic knowledge is lacking. And I think that this is really interesting from you. You're in the schools, you're
Right.
teaching, how do you feel that the curriculum could change?
That's interesting. The curriculum can be challenging, right? I work at a private school, like at the high school level, with, kids that have more resources than others, right? To put it nicely. And then I also work with a community college, it's not community college, but it's a regional college that works with folks from the South Bay, like working class, middle class neighborhoods. The school is part of the California State University system, which is kind of like the little sibling to the UC system of schools, right? So I have these two different populations. The difference in age, right? But also demographics and things of that nature, right? One has more resources than the other one. I can tell you across the board, there's basically like issues with numeracy and literacy, right? There's a unified American problem, right? Regardless of people's level of income, right? That we have to work and challenge. And like critical thinking is a thing that we have to dig in with, right? Across the board. I think that I'm blessed that I teach physics at the collegiate level. I think I'm lucky in that sense because at the end of the day, I like to think of it as advanced word problems, right? There's an equation and there's a technique you can use to it. And then I can get the students to replicate that demonstration of knowledge, right? So even if there's issues with the curriculum itself, there's workarounds. But some other subjects, that's harder to do, I feel like there are challenges there. So I think there's challenges across the board, just in general, regardless of where you may land in the States. And I think some folks are less resourced to basically address those challenges. And there's also less of a demand basically to actually address the challenges, right? At the end of the day, people are looking at high school and college degrees as a kind of like a default like thing you got to do, right? If I want to have a job, I have to have a high school diploma for sure, and I definitely have to have an college degree as well too. You know, I have a lot of people I work with that are going into like kind of like medical realm. You know, so they're going to be doctors and nurses. So their engagement in the class is not going to be exactly the same as someone who wants to be a future physicist, right? So, yeah. I don't know if that addresses your question.
No,
I mean, it's a very good
it
question.
does. It does. And I think your perspective is really interesting. It's like, I'm so glad that we're having this talk because you have this science background plus the arts and the humanities and like, you know, and an educator. So it's unique. I can't see the time. Do you know what time it is? I just want to make sure we're running.
We have time, it's fine.
Okay.
One issue I wanted to go back to, you mentioned about credibility, you know, in the fact that now everybody has their own channel and can publish their own material, etc. So one thing is that seems really ironic is that, you know, we've come from an age from since the print was invented, when the real challenge was basically the lack of information, right? You had to find information and you couldn't find it, which is why the press was so important because it allowed people to have wider access to information. But it seems that we're living in an age now where the problem is the opposite, is the overabundance of information. So that the challenge is not finding it, but curating it, sifting through tons of information on the internet in order to find what is more credible or what can be backed up by science. And this is related to one of the comments right now in the chat about, I have a friend who grew up in East Germany under the Soviet bloc, and he said they actually had classes in high school and college about disinformation. And the thing about, you know, countries like the Soviet Union or currently in China is that these are countries where governments do have like some sort of absolute power to implement, you know, whatever education programs they want, because they know that their populations don't have necessarily the power to question that, you know, like the example that Lamar was talking about in Kansas. You know, how is it possible that a group of people can determine, you know, can decide to kick evolution out of the curriculum? So talking about disinformation, what do you think is the role of scientists or the government in combating disinformation in a country like the US, where people are very sensitive about the idea of personal freedom?
Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, America is like I often think this, like being born as an American citizen is like hitting the life lotto, right? But like there's this whole thing that people who win the lottery, there's always problems, right? So America is like, yay, you're an American citizen, congratulations, you're a small fraction of the world and you have all access to all these things and all these possibilities, congratulations. And there's also going to be 330 million people with the same access to the same possibilities, and some of them are just not going to agree with you ever, right? And then, and in fact, they'll fight actively against your dreams, you know. So there's all of that. I think that what we have, my advice and what I try to live and I try to do is try to engage in the dialogue to a point where it seems like it's comfortable and I don't get exhausted by it. You know, there's been times, particularly with the pandemic, I took a step back. When Layla first reached out to me, I was definitely much more active in social media. Then as the pandemic went on, I got tired of Zuckerberg, barely on Facebook. And then I was basically shadowy on IG, and the Twitter is like, you know, non-existent. And like, yeah, so I think that basically what I'm trying to say is that with the idea of being in this country and you have all these access and all these opportunities, you have to share that with other people who just don't agree, but you have to be engaged. You have to be a part of it. I see a lot of people when I do poke my head in social media, just say how mad they are with the science deniers, whether it be climate change or with the COVID-19 and how they're kicking people out their family, this, that, and the other. And it's like, well, if you're not going to talk to them, why do I have to talk to them? And we can't just let them go off in the corner by themselves. They're not my responsibility. That's your auntie. You go talk to her, right? And I just the same way that, and I think that's vitally important. Basically, it's not fair that scientists, not only do they have to be scientists, but also communicators and educators and cheerleaders for their knowledge. But that's the way that knowledge or dialogues or narratives work. You have a narrative we're trying to compete with narratives, right? There's people who've done all kinds of interesting, silly things, right? And these stories are captivating because they're stories and you're trying to fight it with an equation, right? That equation can win the battle, but it has to have a story as well too, right? And the stories need to be ones that don't just you stick it on the back of our heroes like Newton and Einstein. That's not convincing, right? It's not working. You got to have multiple versions of your story that get to multiple audiences, right? The same thing that might move me if I'm talking about Tycho Brahe or whatever, because we're just nerding out on astronomy, is not going to move the same person down the street or the person behind you in line at Ralph's or, your neighbor across the street at the car wash. It doesn't resonate, and these are the same people who are on the same app as you being told with the same production value that what you know to be true for centuries is just not true at all because, hey, look at the shadow on this mountain, or, with Nicki Minaj with the vaccine, my sister's cousin's brother and Penny, he's an impotent now, right? So, what I mean? This is who you and you're not going to fight that with an equation. You're not going to fight that with a microscope slide. You're not going to fight that. You're going to have to. It's a story someone's telling.
But what's so important about that, Lamar, is that story was everywhere.
Yes.
And I don't watch television really, and I look once a week at YouTube to see what the late night people are saying, just to have an idea. Right. And I was like, it was every single one of them that had the thing of Nicki, and I don't even know who she is, what she does, and I was like, I have to at least kind of have an idea of what happened. And so I was watching the segment, just the clips, and I'm like, is this a Saturday Night Live skit, or is this what? It feels to me like the news is now SNL. It's like there used to be it was more dignified, it was more mature, and now it's I don't watch network television news, but it's it feels like a reality show, and the the sophistication it's out the window. And then I was gonna say, in regards to the social media thing, I think the expectation on academics and scientists is unrealistic, in that I did all this research, 6 years of research, I published my paper, and then we get to the so what? Well, if you want to share this information with people, you need to write articles. Okay. In the old days, you write an article, you don't expect that the audience will engage with you. Maybe there's a letter to the editor, but I actually got pushback from the people that made comments because they said, you're not responding to me, and that you're just putting this out there to stir the pot. And I'm sitting here going, in what world do you read a New York Times article and you expect the guy that wrote the article to get back to you? Who are you? I'm sorry, I don't even know who you are. I didn't even know the thing got published. I'm trying to juggle 4 kids. Right. And then when I pitch a story, say to the New Yorker or something, it's well, what's your social? I'm on LinkedIn, but I'm not on social media. I didn't know LinkedIn isn't social media, but I was told I have to be on Twitter and I have to show audience engagement. Well, I think it's kind of interesting because I'm the smart person who came up with the idea. Why do I have to be the publicist too, just to get to the point to have a forum to share my idea. Now, I'm very media savvy. I have an entertainment industry background, but I can't tell you how many people I met over the years at Harvard, MIT, wherever. They're introverts and they're not going to engage with the public. And so we have an unrealistic expectation that you're going to have 50 million followers or whatever. When I make a tweet, my daughter's still helping me figure out how to do it, but I don't get any likes. And then it's like, well, they expect all these people are going to know it and like everything that I write. And then if not, it's not a good idea. It's like, you know, when we have academics, they're not necessarily going to have the same skill set that's going to transfer to big publicity and celebrity. Right. And so why are we putting the expectations of celebrity on intellectuals? Right. John Nash, you know, his 26-page dissertation, I think it's at Yale, is a really interesting read if you're a smart person, because it was like, you know, brilliant that this happened and so concise. But we don't expect he's a rock star and he's going to be cool and he's going to go on TV and he's in plays on the side. Right. And that everyone that wrote to him over his career, they're going to get a response within hours. Right. You look back and you would laugh. That's crazy. But then why is that now?
Right.
What, like you said, you're a scientist and you're also supposed to be fighting for your idea, but you're competing with Nicki Minaj's cousin or whatever. Right. And it's like, you know, you can't compete with that because it's, would I rather click on you or that I want to know what?
I thought the hero of that situation was the Trinidadian government.
Yes, and they released that.
Because this is when you deal with science deniers, the people that challenge science, you're in a situation where like you have to prove, like they have to basically prove a non-provable thing, right? That this person doesn't exist, right? And they went out of their way to prove that something doesn't exist, which is hard to do, you know. And that's like, we can't, in this instance with Nicki Minaj, there was that avenue where they disproved this person's existence, right? But you can't do that all the time, right? You can't.
Exactly.
So there's a silver lining in that situation, but there are all kinds of limits. You know, I think about the pandemic. The pandemic has been a crash course and a microcosm of all the issues we've had around science communication and elitism and things of that. I think about some of the leading quote unquote rock stars that have been in the front lines, like Dr. Bergs, Dr. Osterholm, Dr. Fauci, and some of their gifts and some of their challenges when it's come to communication. You know, some of it being like, it's just not even their fault. I think that Dr. Fauci is a really good communicator, you know, and but he's also been through this before. He's basically had, this is not even his first or even second rodeo. This might be the biggest platform he's had, but he's dealt with high stakes things since the 80s. I mean, so
and that's such a great point, is that we're watching all of this that we're talking about unfold, that Dr. Fauci is supposed to be very media savvy, but also this brilliant guy, and those skills don't necessarily intersect. And I think that's such a brilliant point. Like as a scientist, you must be like, wait, everyone knows this guy and he's on the thing. And I think he's kind of a rock star. You know?
I think he's doing a very good job. Is it perfect? No.
And the death threats and everything he's getting, and you're just like,
nonetheless, like if he's the gold standard, if he's the Michael Jordan of science communication, right? And he's had literally decades of high stakes experience, right? And he's been getting death threats forever. Like, you know, so like it's, when we're in a situation like, you know, think if you're like the Trinidad and Tobago's Department of Health, and all of a sudden you come into work on a Monday and then you have to find this impossible man, you know, and you have to communicate about that. Like, or, you know, you wrote an article and, you know, about like, you know, the fact that like the privatization of space is a little, you know, can we ask some questions, right? And like, how do we deal with that? You know, I know personally from my personal experience, I've had personal encounters in the world of science where I felt uncomfortable with what I was communicating. I was communicating something and I was getting pushback. And it's, I think every scientist probably has come across that, whether doing a presentation or even a department meeting, you know, and then, so everyone's experience to a certain degrees of discomfort, you get in a situation where it's not comfortable to communicate. I really feel like we should be fostering that, making it easier to communicate and finding more constructive ways that are basically that foster dialogue, that don't make people want to shut down. You know, because if we can't even talk amongst ourselves, and then we have folks outside who are more and more emboldened all across the board in ways to basically challenge us with the fact that they feel like their narrative, since it just is inherently just as good as whatever we're doing, you know, like I think
you're making a very interesting point, both of you, which is, you know, related to somebody commented. Aaron said, this talk is definitely reminding me that I should try harder to be a science explainer. But what you two seem to be saying is that, well, you know, scientists are already doing science, they're already doing research, teaching other people, writing papers, and on top of everything, we expect them to be public figures, publicists, communicators. And like Layla was saying, these are two completely different sets of skills. Somebody might be a scientist genius, but they might not know how to communicate what they're doing. So, I mean, whose role should it?
You know, it's like you said, those skills don't necessarily, you know, maybe you don't want people to know you.
Right.
You don't want to be, I don't want to be on social media or be in front of things, but you have to get your idea out there. But why? You know what I mean? It's like, can't we just remain private? And then if you are out there, then they're so nasty and get personal. And it's like, you know, it's very hard, because it's like, why would you want that? When you look at Dr. Fauci and getting like the death threats and everything, it's like, it makes me not want to be a public person, because that's scary. You know what I mean? It's like, so you have these kind of like, I don't know, it's like this unrealistic expectation and the assumption that everyone wants to be a celebrity. Do you know what I mean? And not everybody does. Not everybody wants to be known.
Yeah. My thing is like, I agree with that. And I think also what I think I would add to that is there's that, but I also feel like there's this thing where people are running away from communicating as well too. Like, so I feel like there's the challenge of those that do stick their necks out, they're going to get chopped, right? And then there's those that aren't communicating at all, right? Not even on the personal level to the people around them in their community, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, there's got to be, it's hard. I fully recognize the fact that communicating to others who are not in your field about your work, or just about things that you understand that they don't. Like, I'm a physicist. I'm not an epidemiologist, right? Not a virologist, but due to the background I have, and I understand exponents, and I can read a logarithmic graph, and I understand what an R number is. I can have an understanding of data that's available on like a website like COVID Act Now, right? Or like the John Hopkins database, right? That the average person may not be able to, because I took a bunch of math courses that other people didn't take, right? I can convey that message to my neighbor. I can convey it to my mom. I can convey it to the person down the street, right? And we need to do that work, right? In order to make the science less elite and more inclusive, that's something that has to happen. But we also have to protect and support the people who are on the front lines and are doing that work, and also give them some grace, right? Like in the fact that not everyone is going to communicate the same way. And like you're saying, if someone wants or needs privacy, right, that should be an option as well too. I think that putting like women's bodies or Black bodies on the line is not the same as other bodies, you know.
Exactly. I think that can't be emphasized enough. And especially, you know, a woman, then they start picking apart your appearance and all this stuff that has nothing to do with your research. And it's like, and, you know, commenting about your hair and all this. And it's like, wait a minute, like, no, thank you. And I think that's why for me, it's been a very conscious decision not to engage in social media, not to be on at all, not to talk, and how hard it's been to try to do something even like this, because how is it going to be taken out of context, or they can put together a clip and use it in a way that isn't really authentic or wasn't the purpose. And it's like, I'm aware of all that from the entertainment background. And so that's why it's like, no, thank you. I'm not going to open Pandora's box. In terms of communication, I wanted to acknowledge Alexander McDonald is the chief economist at NASA. I reached out to him when I was working on my thesis, and he's been so supportive of my research and willing to engage and talk to me when I was developing my theory. And so it's important, I think, to acknowledge that it was white men who've allowed me to engage with them that are in the space community, that there are good guys that are very open and willing to talk. My friend Nicholas Guam, he has a company called Orbit, which is like space tourism. And I just wrote an article, completely ripping apart space tourism. And so I think it's important to acknowledge not all of it is bad, everything is wrong. I'm not saying that. I'm saying let's look at a counter perspective. And I think like the intention behind a company like Orbit, the culture, he's always been willing to engage and talk with me about my ideas instead of just shutting it down. And so I think it's like, and look at Space Review, you've got Jeff Faust. He took a chance just by publishing my article. And I'm sure he was getting pushback, not just publicly, but his people texting him, why are you putting this out there? And it's like, he's a white male that's running a space review. It's been around for a long time. And I think that's where you see the real openness to diversity and inclusion and moving the dialogue along, is just by being willing to publish this piece. You know what I mean? Without, and knowing he's probably going to get pushback or this is a new idea. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that it's like, not for me in the space community, it's not white men that are the problem. It's the idea that there's not more voices, right, and there are not more interesting voices. And I feel like people then will point to this woman or this Black person. And that's a lot of what Lamar and I talk about, is like, just because you put a woman out there, or you put a minority, a person of color, it doesn't mean that female-centric priorities are taking place. Right. And it doesn't mean that we have diverse backgrounds. You know what I mean? It's not add woman and stir and like things right. will just work. Right. And so I think people need to be more thoughtful about, what kind of inclusion they're trying to create, and to look at people as, whole individuals, and not just based on their, height, weight, right. marital status, their demographics. And
sexual orientation, gender expression, all that.
I was going to ask you, Lamar, because we're talking about counterculture. I don't know how we're doing on time, but like, is there any counterculture belief you have that like people would be surprised? Any kind of
like conspiracy theory I subscribe to?
Yeah, or something, like we all have our counterculture,
Right.
Or no?
I'm trying to think. I don't think I have anything that's like would be so mind blowing to anyone that I believe that would just like, whoa. I mean,
well, no, I mean, it's not like your secret basement with like your maze or whatever.
Yes, it's like, I believe I work through the fifth dimension, and like nothing like that. And there's a lizard people or the hollow earth or anything like that.
How about like weird, experiences?
Oh, weird experiences? Okay.
A lot.
So yeah,
we're in LA. I mean, isn't everything here is counterculture? It's in the air.
Right. If you want to know weird experiences in LA, that's easy, right?
I mean, it's
one thing I would say, and I hope he's okay with this. He's pretty public in the flat earther community. Is I've reached out and I've befriended a guy named Wendell. Wendell is actually a very intelligent man, and he works in audio installations. Like he does like things with basically getting acoustics right, and it's a very LA job, So he knows his stuff. He's definitely scientifically literate, like in a lot of ways that the average person who would go up to him and laugh at him is not, right? If there was a science test and the person was like, the world's totally round, Wendell, you're whatever, right? And his Wendell's like, okay, bet, let's have a science test. Wendell wins, hands down.
That's really interesting.
9 times out of 10. Like,
and he's a flat earther.
Yeah, because he asks questions, and those questions come from the fact that this is my personal read, and if Wendell was here, I'm sure he would have his read of it, and he'll probably make a video about it, right? But he has his own questions. He wouldn't come out and just say he's a flat earther. From what I've talked to him, he's basically said he's a questioner. And like, you can find Wendell on YouTube and stuff like that. He's been part of some major things. but he has a deep questioning of it. And I think it's just the fact that the number has been given to him of the diameter, the mass, everything of the earth, and he really just questions it. And he's had trouble verifying it on his own, right? And I respect him in a lot of ways because one, he's just a kind, nice guy, right? He's been kinder to me than a lot of scientists who I've shared time and space with at conferences or done things with. He's never condescended to me. I've definitely had that. I have stories that would peel the paint off the wall, right? That I wouldn't share because me just even sharing the stories basically marginalizes me and my access to knowledge, right? You know, and I'm just an adjunct professor at a California State University. My knowledge and access is already limited as it is, right? So we have the fact that he has more social grace. He's more engaging. His community is more welcoming, right? I, as a professor, feel more welcome with them than I do going to an APS conference, right?
That's fascinating.
But it's just real.
And right.
That's why there's so many flat earthers, because
right.
they're nice.
Right. because they feel marginalized.
Yeah. And like, if you're nice and you're smart and you do cool things and it's a cool way to spend the weekend, you're going to go out to Salton Sea and play around with some lasers, or go out into a boat in the ocean and play around with some lasers. Right. And like, that sounds like a lot of fun, as opposed to like, hey, stay in this basement and do this research and don't see your family, right? Not fun, right?
So it really goes back to a point that you both been making about, we all need to be more inclusive for people to feel accepted and not to generate such anti-science sentiments, because how would they not when we are acting so condescendingly towards them?
Right.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you both. This was a very engaging conversation. I enjoyed it, and I think the audience enjoyed it too. So thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the audience for watching.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting this. This was a lot of fun.
All right, well, bye-bye.